Okay, hello. We will now be
Hi there.
all right. Welcome to Nancy, Jean, and Morgan's presentation, Meet Our Native Plants. They are part of the Wild Ones, a native plant organization, and we are so glad that they are here with us today. And here is Nancy.
Well, thank you for coming today to meet some of our native plants. Meeting them in picture and story is terrific. We're really glad for your interest, and we're eager for you to find a place to meet them in person. We have 3 presenters, and we've all spent the last decade or so getting to know native Midwestern plants through researching them, meeting them in the wild, and planting them at home where we can live with them, and with the butterflies, bees, birds, and other wildlife that they feed and shelter. We hope to stir up lots of questions for you to explore, particularly outside in the woodlands, prairies, and wetlands of the forest preserves, and in public native plantings where you live, or best of all, in your own yard where you can take your time, watch things change, and tune in to the everyday aliveness. There's an amazingly diverse bunch of plants native to this country. And if you introduce yourself, if you begin to look closely, you'll find they will reward you with gifts of beauty, of puzzles and surprises, of a keen eye, a way of looking and feeling that nurtures you and nudges you in the direction of well-being. The wild world calls us. It calls us to see specific plants and the specific insects they host. It calls us to appreciate how differently these grasses bloom, how differently the leaves of Jacob's ladder, alumroot, and culver's root have evolved, how differently columbine, thistle, thimbleweed, and sensitive plant bear their seeds. Peter Forbes of the Center for Whole Communities has said that we in our consumption-driven world can recognize 100 product brands, but cannot name 10 plants native to where we live. If we don't even recognize native plants, we can hardly care about them. Knowing their genius, beauty, and contributions affects the choices we make. Our language for the wild world is disappearing along with the ecosystems themselves. In 2007, 40 words about nature were left out of the new edition of the Oxford Junior Dictionary. Words like fern, acorn, willow, wren, and raven. We hope that through meeting some of our native plants today, you'll catch some of our passion for recovering our displaced ecosystems, as Robert McFarlane and Jackie Morris were inspired to do for the words lost from the dictionary. Part of fun in learning about native plants is exploring together. It's great to have someone to ask or be the one who has an answer. But when I'm on my own, I often turn to an app on my phone. iNaturalist is a free app, a social networking project by more than 1 million naturalists, citizen scientists, and biologists to map biodiversity around the world. Picture this is a plant identification app with an annual fee that can give me a second opinion. You'll notice that on our slides, we show the scientific name along with the common names. And that's because plants often have more than one common name, and it can get confusing. So if you're buying native plants in order to create habitat at your home or school, use the scientific name to avoid planting invasive plants like these by mistake. And if you see a name like this one, you know the native plant has been redesigned to appeal to humans It may no longer work like the native plant that evolved with the insects and birds and feeds and shelters them. Here, the color of the leaf has been changed, making the plant appeal to the human eye. This plant, by contrast, appeals to the insects it naturally hosts. So let the introductions begin underground. Here's one of my favorite spring plants. Meet bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. Bloodroot makes its way up through the leaf litter in early spring. You can see that as they emerge, the leaf is wrapped around the stem and the single bloom. The bloom stretches up, the leaf unfurls, and the plants provide a stunning display that lasts only a couple of weeks. The flowers disappear soon after pollination. The plants go dormant, and even the leaves disappear by midsummer. Bloodroot is ephemeral. It does not usually persist through the summer. Now, this may well be a large clonal colony. Above ground, it looks like lots of individual bloodroot plants, but underground, they're interconnected. They are all clones of the same plant. Bloodroot grows from a horizontal underground stem called a rhizome. This picture shows both roots and stems growing out of the rhizome. As the rhizomes grow and spread underground, they send up new plants. They reproduce, but all the plants have the same genetics. But bloodroot doesn't just reproduce by rhizomes. It also produces seeds. When a bloodroot seed finds its way into the ground and germinates, the new plant is not a clone. It develops a new rhizome with different genes, different DNA. Developing seeds allows bloodroot to spread to new locations. Seeds often hitch a ride with an ant. The ants don't eat the seeds, but they love the elaiosome attached to it. See the white wormy matter attached to each of the seeds? That's elaiosome. It's a mixture of fat, protein, and carbohydrates, which is quite attractive to the ant. So the ant carries off the seed to its nest, where it eats the elaiosome and leaves the seed itself in their midden, their garbage heap. These seeds often germinate, producing new bloodroot plants with new rhizomes. And here's a great word, myrmecochory, shorthand for this behavior. Here you see where bloodroot gets its name. Its poisonous root, actually a rhizome, can be used to make red or orange dye. Now, no one feeds or waters the bloodroot growing out in nature. Where does it get its food? The food it needs to live, reproduce, and thrive. Well, the plant stores some food in these underground rhizomes and can use it as needed. And you know that most plants make their own food using sun, air, and water. They are autotrophic. They feed themselves, like an autograph where you write your name, your own name. But the photosynthesis happening in the leaves above ground is not the whole story. Plants are also busy below ground. They pull up water and nutrients through their roots, and they partner with other organisms to bring them what they can't reach. Soil is full of amazing creatures, some big enough to see, and many so small that in a teaspoon of healthy soil, not dirt, there can be billions of tiny life forms, soil organisms, visible or not, that work with great skill in organized ways to keep the earth in balance and functioning. We're going to focus here on one kind of soil organism, on one kind of partnership. A partnership with fungus, often pronounced fungi in the plural. It's a relationship that many scientists are actively studying today. Now, fungus is not a plant. Fungus is not an animal. It's fungus. The filaments of fungus are called hyphae. One filament's a hypha. And they branch and rebranch over and over to form a complex network called mycelium. A hypha alone is microscopic, but hyphae grow together in such masses that the resulting mycelium can often be seen, as in this photo of mycelium growing through the soil. Strands of mycelium, hyphae, are so small that our teaspoon of soil could contain 8 miles or more of these microscopic filaments if they were laid end to end. So how do fungi interact with plants? Well, fungus forms mycorrhizae, connections with plant roots. These mycorrhizal connections pass nutrients to the plant and carbohydrates to the fungus. Both organisms, plant and fungus, get what they need to grow. It's a mutualistic form of a symbiotic relationship. In this cross-section of a plant root, you see that a mycorrhiza can form inside the cell of the root, as you see on the left here, or around the cells or in between them, as you see here. In these mycorrhizae is where the actual exchange of nutrients between plant and fungus takes place. The interaction between plants and fungi is complex, and there's lots to discover, in particular, which plants can form mycorrhizae with which fungi. Like other relationships you'll be hearing about, plants can form mycorrhizae with some fungi and not with others. Most of the land plants on Earth do form these mycorrhizal relationships with specific fungi. From wild ginger, a ground cover that spreads from its shallow rhizomes, no relationship to the spice, to lovely low-growing prairie smoke, which is also rhizomatous, to the stately queen of the prairie, which spreads by rhizome, but also develops a deep taproot, to foam flower, which sends out above ground stems or stolons, often called runners, to start new plants where there's room to grow, to green dragon and its cousin Jack in the Pulpit, which grow at woodland edges. Each of these species form mycorrhizal relationships with specific fungi in order to thrive. So now meet ghost pipe. This is a plant, but it sure looks different from its neighbors. It does have a stem, leaf, and flower. What's missing? Yep, the green pigment of chlorophyll. This species clearly does not use photosynthesis. It has another strategy for getting food. And I imagine you've already guessed what it is. Like other plants, ghost pipe forms a symbiotic relationship with fungi, but it's not a mutualistic relationship like most plants. Rather, it's parasitic. And here you see the names of the specific fungus that ghost pipe can parasitize. These are specific, not general relationships. Ghost pipe is not an autograph like green plants that feed themselves, but a microtroph. I said autograph, autotroph. Ghost pipe is not an autotroph like green plants, but a microtroph. It gets its food from fungi. Ghost pipe grows under trees, potentially in deep woods, and uses fungi to obtain food from the trees and other nearby plants. Without photosynthesis, it has nothing to trade. It doesn't have carbohydrates or carbon for the fungi. So it's a one-way transfer instead of an exchange, a parasitic relationship with the plant receiving all the benefits. Different? Yes, but like many green plants, this cousin to the blueberry rewards its pollinator bumblebees with both nectar and pollen. Here you see the plant with the seeds ready to be dispersed. See how its flowers have turned up instead of hanging down? Well, ghost pipe is one of 3,000 species of microtrophic plants, plants that get their nutrients from fungi. Let's follow one of those nutrients to a specialized family of plants. Do you know which gas in the atmosphere is most plentiful? If you said oxygen, it would be a good guess. But it's actually nitrogen that makes up about 78% of the air. But despite the abundance of nitrogen surrounding plants in the air, it is lack of nitrogen that most often limits plants' ability to grow or thrive. That's because most plants can't capture nitrogen directly from air like they capture sunlight with their leaves. To see one way plants solve this dilemma, let me introduce wild senna, a lovely herbaceous plant with beautiful leaves, blooms, and seed pods. One that's even tall and thick enough in a sunny setting that it can be used as a hedge. But there's another reason wild senna makes a great addition to the landscape. Wild senna is part of the pea family. It's a legume, and legumes, with the help of bacteria, are able to take in nitrogen from air and fix it. It's not broken. Fixing it means converting it into a different form of nitrogen, a kind of nitrogen that the plant can use to build cells and tissues. The bacteria that fix nitrogen are rhizobia. Rhizobia living in the soil, they invade plant tissue of legumes growing nearby. Both the plant and the bacteria guide the process of establishing a symbiotic relationship that is mutual. They both benefit. The rhizobia break down nitrogen from air pockets in the soil and supply the plant nitrogen it can use. And the plant gives the bacteria sugars it made through photosynthesis. See the nodules? That's where the conversion of nitrogen actually takes place. Again, this process is complex, and there is much to learn. Here you see cross-sections of nodules from the roots of legumes. The red cells get their color from active nitrogen, leg hemoglobin or legume hemoglobin, which has a function similar to that of the hemoglobin in our blood. The redder the nodule, the more active it is. The Illinois sensitive plant is another attractive native plant that fixes nitrogen, a legume, like wild senna. This plant gets its name from its ability to control the angle of its leaves, folding them together at night, angling them toward the sun when the sun's rays are weaker, and partially closing them during hot, sunny days in order to prevent the loss of moisture. And there's something else very interesting about this plant. It's high in protein. For that reason, its leaves appeal to grazing animals who need that protein, and its seeds are of interest to humans. Scientists are trying to develop a perennial grain for us to eat, one that doesn't have to be planted each year like wheat and soybeans do. Turns out they're experimenting with the Illinois sensitive plant because its seeds are so high in protein. There's nearly as much protein in the seeds in these pods as there is in soybeans. Wrapping up, just a word about taproots. This is prairie dock, a big imposing plant whose very long taproot can run down as deep as 14 feet. Prairie dock has notable leaves, large and hairy on the undersides. The plant's bloom stalks can grow up to 10 feet tall. This is a plant with attitude. It makes a statement when you plant it as an accent. I hope you see this plant in person and can hold a leaf between your hands to feel its cooling effect. Now, I expect to find a big, long taproot on this big, tall prairie plant. But I've learned that the rather dainty little wine cups or purple poppy mallow have a huge taproot. This plant grows only 6 to 8 inches above ground, but it can grow a taproot as deep as 6 feet. And at the top, just below the surface, this taproot can be as big around as your water bottle. Why might a plant develop a large taproot? Well, we know one reason. The deep taproot helps the plant survive drought conditions because their taproot can pull up moisture from far below the ground. Notice in the diagram that a taproot is not a single root. It has smaller roots branching from the primary root, the root that develops first when the seed begins to grow. Taproots are true roots, and unlike a fibrous root system, they anchor the plant deeply into the soil. Taproots can also store food for the plant, helping it survive when conditions are not favorable or when the above ground parts of it have been mowed down or eaten. Well, with lots more plants to meet and interesting things to discover, here's Morgan to take you above ground.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And good morning, everybody. As Nancy said, my name is Morgan. And unlike Nancy, who is a beautiful science storyteller, I'm more of a science nerd. So I tend to be a bit more prosaic and factoid driven. So let's get started. I'm going to be talking about stems and leaves. And with stems, these really support and transport for the plant. The stems are the skeletons of the plants. So they support and connect the roots to the leaves, flowers, and fruits. They also conceal a circulatory system that will transport water and food around the plant. But stems also serve other roles that they've developed through coevolution with their environment. First off, protection. Stems can actually be used to help protect the environment. In this case, buttonbush, wood ducks use the plant's thickets for nesting and for cover. It also makes a very useful erosion control and stream bank stabilization. The other kind of cool, go back 1 second. The other kind of cool thing about buttonbush is that it attracts a lot of different Lepidoptera. And one of the main ones is the beautiful wood nymph, who is attracted to this particular one and is known to use it as a host plant. All right, next slide. Another area that stems help with is in defense. They do this through thorns, spines, or prickles. Thorns are basically just pointy stems that stab, very simple. Prickles, on the other hand, are actually extensions of the epidermis of the stem. That's like the skin of the stem. And spines are modified leaves. So these different types of defenses come from different parts of the plant. Most people tend to think that roses have thorns, but they're actually prickles. They're those extensions of the epidermis. And here's a great example, the prairie rose, which, as you can kind of see a little bit in the bottom, has those little prickles. What's nice about this, as opposed to just kind of regular roses, is that they're sort of few and far apart, so it's not quite as difficult to work with. All right, and then there are a lot of different modified stems, and Nancy had gone over some of these, so I'll kind of keep this brief, but it is important to understand how these stems developed because they play a role in protecting the plant from herbivores. So there are bulbs, which are kind of a round mass of swollen leaf bases at the base of the plant, and it protects and feeds new shoots. Corms are modified underground stems, again in that bulb shape. Rhizomes, another modified underground stem, but they grow horizontally. And tubers can be derived from either stems or roots. And Nancy had also mentioned stolons, which are, again, horizontal stems. They can kind of creep above or below. And green dragon is a great example of a corm. That's that modified underground stem that's in the bulb shape. And what they do is they use these corms to store food during the winter time so that it's available for them when times are better. And a nice side note on this is Indians would actually use corms for food, but they discovered that they had to dry them out first because the corms in these green dragons have something called calcium oxalate, which is a crystal that could stab the inside of your mouth and cause some severe pain. So they figured out how to prevent that from happening and use the corms for food. All right, next slide. And here's another modified stem, again, a stolon, which wild strawberry is a great example of this. You can see on the left side, all those little red stolons down there trying to keep going and creep across the soil to form their baby plants at the nodes. I like to actually put these in planters like this one because wild strawberry is very good at taking over an area because of those stolons. All right, next slide. All right, on to leaves, and just a few basic pieces about their anatomy. There are three main aspects to a leaf. There's the mesophyll cells, which are cells that harvest light for photosynthesis. There are the veins, which move nutrients and water across the leaf. And then there are the pores, which are the stomata. That allows CO2 to come in, and they close to prevent water loss. All right, next slide. So leaves are really interesting when it comes to coevolution and just evolution in general within their specific environment, because there are a lot of ways that they can be shaped or their various characteristics that can help them survive their environment. One of these is evergreen versus deciduous leaves. Evergreen leaves, of course, are there that are all year round, whereas deciduous, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with that one, they get discarded during certain times of the year. And there is a cost benefit to this. Leaves require a lot of nutrients and energy to form. So when you have an evergreen leaf that's there all year round, that minimizes the demands on your resources for the long term. However, if your leaf is unlikely to survive all year round, then deciduous leaves may be your best option. They produce dormant buds that contain partially developed leaves. Those buds protect them during the winter, and then when spring comes, they can quickly establish those leaves. Examples in our area of an evergreen is an eastern red cedar. We don't have a ton of evergreens that are native, but this is one of them. And then things like the white oak or oaks in general, as well as maples, all of those things are deciduous. We, of course, have a lot of leaves that fall back in the fall or die back in the fall. All right, now my favorite is something called phyllotaxis. And this just means the way that leaves are arranged on a stem. We all know that it's important to make sure that for a plant, it doesn't get shaded out by its neighbors. It still has to keep, enough area so that it can get plenty of sun for photosynthesis. However, plants also have to make sure that they avoid shading out their own leaves. So phyllotaxis can occur in patterns that are very specific to each plant species that prevents the upper leaves from blocking light to the lower leaves. This enables the plant to absorb as much sunlight as possible. Scientists think that it's a growth hormone called auxin and the proteins that transport it that are responsible for these patterns. Leaves that are already there can actually inhibit the growth of other leaves, so they can protect their personal space. They give off signals saying, hey, don't grow too close to me. What's neat is that scientists using this idea have created mathematical models that can actually predict where leaves will show up on a plant. And of course, when you have spiral patterned plants, the most common formation is the Fibonacci spiral. Everybody's favorite sequence in math, or at least it's mine. I don't know about you. All right, next slide. So to go through some examples of leaf arrangements, the first one is the alternate arrangement, which is actually the most common. In this arrangement, leaves spiral around the stem. At the shoot tip, the growth hormone auxin will flow into the developing leaves. And the lack of auxin on the opposite side of the shoot tip will make a new leaf develop in the furthest spot from the previous leaf, ensuring that they're both spaced in such a way to get the most sunlight. Examples that we have of this are pagoda dogwood, which is actually the only dogwood in Illinois that is in the alternate leaf position. All the others have opposite. And then there's also New England aster. This is a fabulous native plant. The alternate leaves become smaller as they go up the stem, as you can see. And it is a host plant for so many different butterflies and moths, including the pearl crescent, the checker spot butterfly, and the wavy lined emerald moth. All right, so our next one is the opposite leaf position. These are pairs that can be parallel or offset by 90 degrees, and they can collect sunlight from multiple directions at once. And the cup plant is a wonderful example of this. This can get up to about 10 feet tall. And as you can see, the stem remains unbranched for most of the way up until you get to the flowers. The large opposite leaves actually connect in the middle by the stem, and they form a cup that can actually hold water. And as a fun side note, Indians would often use the rainwater in these cup plants as emergency drinking water. Something to keep in mind if you're ever lost in a prairie. All right, and then the world leaf arrangement. These are just groups of leaves, and they're arranged relatively widely spaced along the stem to avoid shading the leaves out. So you can see in this example, Culver's root, at the bottom, there's kind of a large grouping of leaves, and then there's a very big space until the next grouping of leaves below the flowers. All right, and then the basal leaf arrangement, these grow lowest on the stem of the plant, and they're close to the ground because they're good protection for the roots of the plant, and they can also help conserve water. I wanted to show these three different plants because although they're native plants and they all have basal leaf arrangements, they're all very different. So the first is pussy toes, which only gets up to about 6 inches in height. And it just has that basal rosette of leaves at the bottom of the plant and a little tiny inflorescence of flowers that pops up. And this is a host plant for the caterpillar of the American painted lady butterfly, which likes to feed on the leaves. In the middle, we have compass plant, which is named for its ability for the large leaves that you see there. They're very divided and toothy. They will often orient themselves in a north-south direction to get as much sun as possible. But that divisions that you see in those leaves and those tooths actually help cool it down. So it gets a lot of sun for photosynthesis, but it has those deeply divided leaves so that it doesn't get so hot in that prairie sun. And then the final plant, prairie dock, again, one that can get up to about 9 to 10 feet in height. Whereas compass plant and many prairie plants have those divided leaves, you'll see prairie dock is a full big leaf at the base there. And as Nancy had mentioned, it has little tufts of hair on it, which help keep it cool. So not only can you use it to cool your hands down, but it uses it to also cool its own leaves down. So it can grab a lot of sun, but not overheat. And finally, modified leaves. This is my favorite. Northern pitcher plant is the only carnivorous plant in Illinois. And it does so by having very highly modified leaves. You can see that there's a kind of a tube shape and it's swollen in the middle. That's where it collects. There's a bunch of water in there. And they can get about 3 to 8 inches long. So they're not very big. At the top of each leaf, there's a little flap that opens in the front. It's used to attract prey and to prevent a lot of rainwater from gathering in their little trap. The upper surface of each leaf has a lot of kind of bristly hairs that impede the ability of insects from getting out. And some of them fall into that water, they die, and their decaying bodies are used to, are absorbed by the plant, which they use for nutrients. This has a lot of really cool co-evolutionary relationships with insects. For instance, there is a pitcher plant fly which pollinates this plant. The larvae will live inside of the fluid of the tubular leaves, where they'll feed on small little insects that get trapped there. There's also larvae that develop in the fluid of the leaves that include the pitcher plant midge and the pitcher plant mosquito. All right, and then finally, leaf morphology. This is very huge in helping the plant survive in its particular environment. Something to keep in mind is that plants use less than 5% of the water they take in from the soil. The rest of it evaporates through transpiration, specifically through the stomata or those pores that are in the leaves of the plant. So there's different considerations that have to be taken into account when thinking about how a plant can adapt to its environment. The first has to do with leaf size. Leaves that have a greater surface area for photosynthesis will also transpire more water. So they'll lose more water. If you're in a wet tropical region, this isn't such a problem. It cools you down and you have plenty of water to help you along the way. But if you're in a cold region, you're going to need smaller plants that lose less heat and that minimize the chance of frost damage. And of course, desert plants have tiny to no leaves to help reduce water evaporation. In temperate climates like ours, you're going to actually have mid-sized leaves more often than not to help maximize photosynthesis and prevent excessive water loss. The pagoda dogwood leaves are a good example of this, but also looking at oak and maple leaves too, you have that kind of good mid-size to go with. Next is shape. Leaf shapes that survive evolutionarily are just better suited to a plant's needs and environment. But this can take on different forms. Looking at the prairie dock leaf shape, as I mentioned earlier, typically prairie plants are cut or divided to reduce heat gain during that midday full sun. But prairie dock has those very large leaves that don't have any divisions on them. And so they're able to take in a lot of sunlight, but with those little hairs they have on their surface that make it nice and rough, they can cool the leaves down so they don't overheat during that hot sun. And then finally, leaf margins. That's just the edge of the leaf. When you have leaves that are serrated lobe, that kind of toothy look to them, they increase the air movement around them, and that leads to water loss, but it also allows them to take in more carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. If you have a smooth edge, like desert plants, you lose less internal water, or if you're in a rainforest, you can actually shed rainwater rapidly so that doesn't weigh down your leaves. For a prairie plant like cup plant, you can see there that it has those very toothy margins on it. They have those coarse, widely spaced teeth. And so that might mean, okay, so it loses some water, but of course it increases the air movement around it so it keeps cool, but cup plant also can hold on to water in its little leaf arrangement there with those opposite leaves. So what this comes down to is that when you're thinking about evolution, just remember it doesn't create perfect, but it does select for the best option that's currently available in its environment. All right, so now I'm going to pass it on to Jean.
Thank you so much, Morgan. I get to talk about flowers. But first of all, I can say without hesitation, the source of some of my most intense experiences is when I have been present for something remarkable or breathtaking, usually something I've witnessed about the natural world, of course. It seems there's a story behind each one. Here, I'll offer some examples of what leaves me amazed and astonished by the ingenious developments in the world of native plants, flowers, and their pollinators. By the time the first settlers came to America from Europe, native plants and insects had developed such specialized relationships, their very lives depended on each other. And the most well-known relationship is the monarch butterfly with the milkweed plant. The monarch can seek nectar from the flowers of many plants that produce it, but through coevolution, she can only lay her pinhead-sized egg on the milkweed plant, so that when that tiny, very hungry caterpillar hatches, it can eat the milkweed leaves to develop. Since all leaves are solar collectors, he is eating the energy of the sun. Many do not realize this kind of specialist to host relationship is true of 90% of our native insects. What? You mean only 10% of our native insects can eat more than one plant? Amazing and surprising. Let's take that sense of surprise a step further. Plants have evolved ways to lure, signal, might we say trick, bees, butterflies, and other pollinators, often with the promise of sugary nectar as a reward. Color, shape, petal formations, markings, scent, arrangement on a stem, all act in ways to attract pollinators to stop by for a sip and then move on to other flowers, thus transferring pollen. The flower on a plant is called inflorescence, which refers to how the blossom is organized and how flowers are arranged on a stem. In the next picture, on the right, on the left, you see assorted species of pollen magnified many times. And on the right, the stamen of a flower is referred to as the male reproductive unit. It's composed of anther and filament. The anther is involved in the production of pollen. Once the pollen grains are mature, they are released into the surrounding environment and will be received by the stigma, which is the female reproductive unit of the flower. You can see the pistil and stigma stands taller than the anthers covered in the brown pollen. The state flower of Illinois is the common blue violet, Viola sororia. It's a great ground cover plant, and often it's found mixed into grass, so some consider them a nuisance. But with their heart-shaped leaves and cheery blue flowers, violets aren't really bad guys. After all, it's the host to the caterpillars, the larvae of many fritillary butterflies. Each blossom sits atop its own leafless stalk, an example of an inflorescence known as cymose. It's what we would call a solitary flower. They are an important nectar source for our native pollinators. The inner throat of each flower is more or less white, from which you see darker veins radiate outward along the lower petals, and these are called nectar guides. And the thing about nectar guides is that humans can't always see what the bees see. We can see all the colors from red to violet, but bees see a spectrum from yellow through ultraviolet. So to bees, even seemingly plain flowers may have bold nectar guide patterns. Spoiler alert, I'm giving you a version of the story about the birds and the bees. When they go for the nectar, they brush against structures called stamen, as you saw, inadvertently transferring the pollen to the female part, which means the flower will be fertilized and able to produce fruit or seeds, ensuring the next generation. Hey guys, wake up. Yes, those busy bees have to take naps sometimes. Bees are in a specialized relationship with the pollen of native plants. And one way they use it is to make bee bread, which is nourishment for their larva when it hatches. Some bees have adapted specialized pollen-carrying structures, pollen baskets, pollen pants on their hind legs. This co-evolution with flowers has created more effective and precise pollen delivery, which means a plant can make far less pollen. Fragrant flowers attract bees, butterflies, moths. Some male insects are tricked into transferring pollen by flowers that look or smell like the females of their species. Flowers with foul odors attract flies, beetles, and similar insects. Okay, let's talk about the putrid category. Skunk cabbage. And one of those is the skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus foetidus, the first native plant flower to emerge, sometimes through the snow, around February in our parts of Illinois. So you will see a huge colony of skunk cabbage in the natural area at Elgin High School. It stinks, and it creates its own heat enough to melt the snow. The putrid odor lures in its pollinators, primarily the flies and gnats, which are attracted to the scent of decomposing flesh. But skunk cabbage can be visited by bees and other insects. The insects, of course, carry the pollen, and some will seek the warmth within their flower. Its inflorescence is called spadix. The white spadix is visible on the right. It's a fleshy floral spike enclosed within a leafy spathe. So spadix and spathe is the term. We've looked at the flower that appears earliest. Let's look at the plant that blooms last. Witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana, is the last woody plant to flower each year with sweetly scented yellow autumn flowers. Each inflorescence is a cluster of 4 crinkly yellow ribbons that still may be visible as late as December. Hamamelis means together. As you see on the right, the flower and fruit appears together. When witch hazel seeds mature in the fall, they explode out of the fruit, distances up to 25 feet. When people walk through the woods in the fall, they would be startled by the sound of the recently exploded witch hazel seeds hitting the ground and the leaves. So they started calling those shrubs witch hazels. It is the larval host for the lovely blue azure butterfly, whose caterpillars eat its leaves. So other animals such as birds and bats, bees, flies, and wasps also pollinate flowers. Some flowers have landing platforms or nectaries at the end of long tubes to match the body parts of the animals that perform the pollination. So here you see, it's true for the hummingbird on the red cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis, in this photo. The bumblebees, back to the bumblebees, have longer tongue and wing vibrating tendencies make them more efficient pollinators for some plants. Bumblebees can forage in cool, unfavorable weather better than other bees, and they use both pollen and nectar for food. Pollen provides the bees with protein and healthy fats, much like our poultry, fish, eggs do for the humans. On the left, the distinctive flowers of Chelone glabra, turtlehead, are said to look like a turtle poking its head out of the shell. This is an important host for the beautiful Baltimore checker spot butterfly larva. These blooms are pollinated mostly by bumblebees, which have the size and strength to pry them open and reach the nectar inside. Bees use their buzzing sound to vibrate the blossom open, buzz pollination. The same is true of the blue bottle gentian, Gentiana andrewsii, on the right. The gentian flower, even at maturity, resembles a closed bud. So bumblebees can force their way into the closed corolla. One can see how this characteristic would exclude the smaller insects that are less efficient at pollination and keeps them from robbing nectar and pollen from the bumblebees. And now for something completely different, Eryngium yuccifolium. The branch stems soar upward, bearing these curious spherical clusters. They're called umbels. Tiny globular seed masses follow and are held in the winter. With the common name rattlesnake master and button snake root, they were used by herbalists and Native Americans who believed the root was good, an antidote for snake bites. And on the right, you see a compound umbel. It is that of the Zizia aria, golden Alexander. Notice the close-up shows how the blossom looks like multiple open umbrellas. Queen of the Prairie, Filipendula rubra, has inflorescence called panicle, 200 to 1,000 small pink petaled flowers on the inflorescence. The numerous stamen give the flowers its fuzzy appearance. The term, this Filipendula rubra is known for its airborne pollen. However, pollination is only effective when pollen is transferred to a different Filipendula plant, not formed off the rhizome of this one. So the term for this is it's self-incompatible, meaning it has to go to a different plant. Interestingly, Filipendula rubra produces no nectar. So butterflies and other nectar seekers waste a lot of energy seeking it here. Its flowers are the source of food for insects that consume pollen. So it's pollinated by bees. Again, this inflorescence is called a panicle. The Actaea pachypoda, baneberry or doll's eyes, is the common name for this one. It has toxic berries, hence the name bane, meaning something that causes death or deadly poison. This flower spike is a type of racemose inflorescence, where the individual flowers do not have stalks and are attached directly to the central axis. The red Lobelia cardinalis, cardinal flower, visited by the hummingbird that you saw earlier, is another example of a flower spike. Purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea, commonly called purple coneflower, is a perennial that is native to the central US. Showy daisy-like purple coneflowers bloom throughout the summer, and it hosts the silvery checker spot butterfly. On the right, you probably recognize the brown-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia triloba. The dead flower stems of both will remain well into the winter, and when the seed heads are visible, they may be visited by goldfinches or other birds that feed on the seeds. They're both examples of what's called a disc and a ray inflorescence. The inner disc flower generally are the complete flowers, and the ray petals and corolla are generally sterile. We've just viewed more than 10 different flower configurations that are the result of coevolution. There are more, of course. With the exception of the common blue violet, all have been examples of the way coevolution has developed to put as many flowers as close together to make their pollen and nectar available to as many pollinators in as short a time with the least expenditure of energy. Fast food, I would call it. It conjures up ideas of McDonald's or the Golden Corral. Do you think you'll start to look at flowers in a different way now? Fascinating, isn't it? It's deeply moving to realize that all this happens around us. We have no ability to do these things for ourselves. It creates a sense of wonder when we begin to grasp how our very lives depend upon these relationships. Native plants take in the sun, interact with numerous creatures, pass that energy up the food chain. It is with deep appreciation that we realize our clean air, our water, our oxygen, our food are the results of billions of interactions by the humblest of creatures. We are indebted to them. If we think of ourselves as interbeings, we see how everything in nature is connected and participates in a circular system of taking and giving. We can follow nature's lead. We can learn to participate in this reciprocity. We can become partners in returning our ecosystems to health. In urban and suburban and rural landscapes alike, planting native plants is an exciting and immediate way for all of us to bring back living landscapes to neighborhoods where turf has been the norm. In doing restorative gardening where we live, let us follow poet Mary Oliver's advice. Pay attention, be amazed, tell about it. Thanks so much for your attention today. We'd be glad to entertain any questions you might have.
All right, so we do have a few questions, and we might go a little over time if that's okay with you guys. Okay.
Sure.
First question is, what are some ways people can work together in their communities to educate and promote information about native plants to their specific area?
Well, we belong to an organization that does exactly that. So one thing would be to get on wildones.org and look for a chapter in your community, banding together people who know a great deal about plants and restoration with people who have a desire to learn is just a terrific way to spread the knowledge and interest and passion for restoring our ecosystems. You guys, Jean, Morgan?
Well, I would say ditto.
Okay.
Yeah, most communities will have garden clubs or organizations like ours that will explore these ideas.
Sierra Club and Isaac Walton League. Morgan, you're nodding your head. Can you think of others that we should? World Wildlife Fund has a wonderful site online that they've worked with Doug Tallamy to list the plants for your zip code that will grow well in your area and host the butterfly caterpillars, the moths, and so forth. So that's a great source. Oh, and the best source of all, just kidding, is our website, startinyouryard.com, and it has all kinds of leads, links to other websites, plant lists, and so forth. So, and there's a place on there where you can be in touch and ask questions directly and specifically. So that's a great starting place for you. That and wildones.org.
Another question we have is, what are some of the more unique species of plants found in America?
Yeah, well, we're familiar with the Midwest, so we can't speak to the Southwest and the West Coast, but my hunch is that some of the most unusual plants would be found there. Morgan mentioned the fact that there are plants that have virtually no leaves, and those definitely grow out there. Anybody else with an idea of an unusual plant?
I call on that northern pitcher plant. That was one of my favorites because it is the only carnivorous plant in our area. Of course, carnivorous plants are really cool, and you can find others elsewhere, but if you want something cool in our area, that's the one to look for.
Well, and my favorite is the skunk cabbage because it does so many things in the way of creating its own heat and shelter. And it's the first flower to emerge. And so that's why we for sure wanted to include it. But you bring up an interesting point because no matter where we live, there is a unique ecosystem that is in place that supports all the services we need as humans. So going out west or to the Southwest, it's like a foreign country to me because I have not studied as a layperson, I have not studied their ecosystem. So, we're the prairie state, and our ecosystems were originally prairie and oak savannas. So that's where our interest is.
That's what we have lived with and have experience with, the plants that we know. And of course, mine was the ghost pipe. I just find that fascinating, and I hope to actually see one of these days.
All right. What is your favorite plant?
I already know this one for me. I love talking about mountain mint, not only because it smells pretty and the bees love it, but it is literally a deer resistant plant. I've seen plants labeled as such, but mountain mint is the only one I've ever seen deer specifically not go near. They do not like the smell. So I like to plant those everywhere because they leave stuff alone.
And I'm like, I'm the mother that I wouldn't be able to name which of my children is my favorite. So I'm unable to name a favorite native.
But one that I always refer to, I absolutely love the prairie smoke plant with its early blooms, and it not only blooms but then it foofs. So it is one of my favorites. I often find myself saying this is my favorite plant, and it's a different plant. But and I just wanted to mention the mountain mint, the name of that plant. It's so interesting. It grows in the prairie, but it's called mountain mint. So we were talking last night at another webinar about how common names come about, and they don't always really make a lot of sense. Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
Another question is, how did each of you get interested in native plants or working with your organization?
Yeah.
Well,
I
Go ahead, Morgan. Or Jean. Morgan.
I was ambushed. So I moved to a new neighborhood in 2020, and the local environmental committee for our HOA was like, you have to join us. And they introduced me to Doug Talamy and all this other stuff. And I actually live in an HOA that is very encouraging of planting native. And so I just fell into it. I was like, okay. So I got really lucky. And then of course I ended up meeting Nancy and Jean through the wild ones, because I got told about all the various native plant sales and all that good stuff. So.
Well, and they got lucky that they got someone like you with all your talents. Yeah.
That's for sure.
So Jean, do you want to go next?
Well, because I'm in the senior citizen category of my life, I've had a whole evolution all my life as a gardener. And I think it was in the late 80s when I started to hear about the prairie coneflower, the purple coneflower that we showed you. And it started to appear more frequently in landscape plantings. And someone said, that's a native to Illinois plant. Uh-oh, I'm frozen. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So anyway, it was then my ears pricked up. You mean there's natives to Illinois? And I just wanted to learn more at that point and know more and use more in my yard.
And just to say, Jean is a professional with plants. She owned a business that was plant-based. So she really has deep knowledge that we call on. And for me, it all happened when I switched from golf to birding. And once I started reading about birds, it was clear I was going to have to do something about my yard where I had a buckthorn hedge. No.
Okay. Are there any plants that thrive in the winter?
Well, my answer would be they all thrive. It's happening underground where we don't see it, because the natives all die back to nothing visibly, but their roots are so deep, as you were hearing in Nancy's presentation, that they lose a small portion of their roots each year, die back, but that benefits the soil actually. And it's a riot going on under the ground all winter long. So they are ready to emerge in the spring.
I
And
don't
also-
throw in the eastern red cedar because that is an evergreen. So if you want something that will, stay green all year round, that's actually a really good one to throw up.
Well, and another of my favorite plants is a plant and leaf sedge, which mine right out here is still kind of a bright green. It'll get all new leaves in the spring, but it makes a nice ground cover even over the winter. And even the dead stems and so forth,
Yep.
to me, those are thriving. There are insects surviving in their hollow stems. So it kind of depends on what you mean by thrive. To me, those dead things are also thriving.
Yeah, I think that brings a good point. Sedges and grasses, not only is it just important in general to have those, but they are beautiful in winter. They may not be green, but they still look lovely sitting along your gardens. So I always suggest that if you're going to do flowering plants, the brightly flowering plants, make sure to plant some grasses and sedges because those look nice in the winter.
Although I have to say the ice really just leveled they were so beautiful and buoyant.
Yep.
All right, we have another question. How do you know if plants are native or not?
That's really a research question.
It's a great
There are a lot
question.
of- Yeah. There are books of native plants. I have one that's such a tome, I can't even pick it up with one hand. And then there is a book that goes through all the native plants in Kane County, which is where we're living and learning. Does somebody else, Jean Morgan, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I can tell you this, something that I learned is that if you want to transplant a non-native, it's a lot easier than trying to transplant a native because native roots go deep. They go deep and wide. And which is great to stabilize structures, things like that, but they're harder to move. So I can tell you the easier it is to move, probably the more likely it's not native.
That is really a good point. Sometimes when I have a question as to whether or not I have a native plant that I'm looking at, it's not in a stage that I recognize. Pulling on it will give me a clue because if it just pulls right out. Now that's not true of something like pussy toes, which grows right on practically on the soil. But of course that one we know, but that is such a good point. Yeah. Okay.
Are there any good invasive species?
Well, last night at this meeting, I was referencing the woman who was speaking made the point, and it's a very good one. All plants are good. It's just a matter of where they're located, whether they're growing with a community that kind of gets along because they've evolved together. They know how to grow together. They have evolved all kinds of strategies for dealing with insects, and the insects have strategies for dealing with the plants. But you pull a plant out of where it belongs and take it somewhere else. And we tend to think from a human perspective, it acts badly. It's a bad plant. But the truth is, it's just a plant that was great at home, but now it's out where it has no insects to feed on it and keep it under control.
No controls.
Yeah, it maybe learned to grow, evolved to grow, coming out earlier than the native plants do here. And the problem with the relationship with birds is the native plants and the birds, as the birds are migrating, the plants have evolved so that all along their trail, the plants are in a stage where they can host the birds that are migrating. That's not true for plants that didn't develop in the area where this migration is taking place. So it's not that they're intrinsically bad, but oh boy, they do some bad things here. And of course, that's not the plant's fault. They didn't, yeah, so.
All right, another question we have is, can the bloodroot be a ground cover that might overpower the chickweed?
I'm not going to say it never could be. I'm thinking of a particular yard where bloodroot has really spread, but typically these spring ephemerals are these little treasures that pop up and thrill us and then go away. Something like dealing with chickweed would take some efforts on the part of the humans, and then that makes room for the bloodroot to grow. There are lots of, in fact, on our site, startinyouryard.com, if you go to the resources page, there's a whole section on places to go for information about invasive plants. So that would be a good place to start.
Right. Thank you all so much. We do have one announcement before we end for the day.
The National Biodiversity Teach-In is a student project that happens because we have so many partners supporting us. One of those partners is Earth Echo International. We are excited to partner with Earth Echo International to promote an opportunity to empower our peers across the country. This year, Earth Echo is excited to open our Echo Challenge STEM competition to students in the U.S., grades 5 through 9. 10 finalists would advance for a chance to win top prizes of $1,000, $2,500, and $5,000.
If you have any questions, please feel free to email us. Thank you all so much for your presentation. We really enjoyed it and we learned some really cool stuff today. So thank you for your time.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
You're
for having
welcome.
us.
Have a
Yeah.
nice day.
You too.
Thank you.